In this video, you're going to learn how to create culture on your worship team. Culture is who your worship team actually is, and you're going to create it regardless of whether you focus on it or not. But if you want it to be good, I'm going to share with you how to create, I guess, more of a good culture in this video coming up. Hey, Spencer here from Leading Worship Well. This is the place where we talk about how to lead yourself well, lead your church well, and lead worship well. Before we get into things, one of the best ways to create worship team culture, or one of the best places to do it, I guess I should say, is during your worship team rehearsal. And so I want to share with you, before we get into things, down in the description below, right at the top of it, there is a link to a free PDF I put together called the Worship Rehearsal Blueprint. In that Worship Rehearsal Blueprint, I share with you the 5-part system that you need to have in place to have the best worship rehearsal ever that will lead your team spiritually, relationally, and musically. So check that out in the description below. But in this video, we're specifically talking about how to create culture. And yes, you can do that at your worship rehearsal, but you can do it in every instance of your worship ministry. In every area of your worship ministry, you have the ability, the opportunity to create a culture that you want. And like I said, you will create a culture whether you want to or not. It's just, will you be aware that you are creating it? And if you are aware that you are creating a culture, the very things that make your worship team what they are, and the way that you do things and why you do them, that's what culture is. If you're aware of them, then you have the opportunity to guide them and form them and shape them. But if you don't, if you aren't aware of them, then you won't have that opportunity, and your culture will just form into this ugly, malformed, disgusting mess. Usually that's how it happens. Maybe that's a bit dramatic, but I want to hear from you before we jump into how to create this culture. If you've thought about this before, what are the key points of the culture points of your worship ministry? Like, what are the things that make your worship ministry your worship ministry? I know that some churches have like these clever little sayings. I'd love to hear those. Whatever they are, if you've thought about it, let us know down in the description below. You'll give everybody watching this video some ideas on what they can start to form in their worship ministries, what kind of culture they can form. So let us know down in the comments below. I'll talk to you in a second. Thanks so much for leaving your answer down in the comments below. Let's get into how to actually create culture, the culture that you want in your worship ministry. Number one, and I hope I've already started you on this process with that first question, but the first thing that you need to do to create the culture that you want in your worship team is to identify what is important in your worship ministry. You have to actually identify what you want the culture to be. And so look at some of those comments down in the comments below and see what other people are saying. And you can take those for your worship ministry. I'm sure nobody will be mad at you for doing that. Or if you have your own and you say, for example, what would be a culture piece that might be important? Maybe it's important that people are on time and prepared. That's an important culture piece, right? Maybe it's important that worship is more than just music. It's not just we show up on Sunday and we play a couple songs and go home. No, worship is a spiritual act. Maybe it's important that everybody knows that they are all worship leaders, that they aren't just musicians, but they are actually leading worship in everything that they do whenever they're on your worship team. These are culture pieces. I can't create them for you. You need to think about what is important. And I think one of the easiest ways to figure out what is important is to think about like what really makes you mad in your worship ministry. I feel like that's a helpful exercise. For instance, if people are always late, you're mad because it's important that they're not late to worship rehearsal. So that would be identifying something that's important. That's just a helpful little exercise. Think, what are the top 3 things that make me angry in my worship rehearsal? Now, don't use that as a pass to just passively aggressively point out these flaws in people, but do it with the right heart, right? And do it appropriately. But I think that helps you identify what's important. I think maybe if you could come up with a list of 5 key points that are important maybe 3 to 5 key points that are important for your worship ministry culture, and you can actually specifically say them. For instance, for us, one of them is we are all worship leaders. Write those down, and then we're going to use those in these next points. So first step, identify what is important in your worship ministry. Second thing you need to do to create the culture that you want in your worship ministry is to, now that you've identified what's important, communicate it to your worship team. So often, I think we go through these processes of like planning this amazing stuff for our worship team, our worship ministry, like the big picture. And we've got it in our heads, but then we never share it with our team. And we're like, 2 weeks ago, I was so passionate in my own brain about people showing up to rehearsal on time, but nobody's doing it still. What do I need to do? Do I need to do this? 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 Maybe you just need to tell them that that's important. We always skip the most important steps, right? That is the most important step, to actually communicate it to your team. So take those 3 to 5 things that you've identified as important, and maybe for the next 5 weeks at your worship rehearsal, those form your devotional time. A devotion is one of the key points to a great worship rehearsal. That's down in the worship rehearsal blueprint down below. But maybe you use those for devotional and you just talk about it. You know, we are all worship leaders. That's a great devotional point to start with. You talk about how everybody on the team is not just a musician, they're a worship leader. If you need help with that conversation, I actually wrote a devotional called We Are All Worship Leaders. You can check that out at leadingworshipwell.com. But communicate it to your team. Let them know those 3 to 5 points that are important to your team. That is the next step. Actually communicate it to your team, and also not just to the team that you have right now, but these are great things to put in your worship ministry guidelines. So when somebody joins the team, they see these key pieces of your worship team culture and they're aware of them before they actually join the team. On to number 3. Number 3, we've identified what's important. We've communicated it to our team. Now what do? We communicate it again. We tell them again and again and again. If you have 5 key points to your worship ministry, 5 key culture pieces, we'll call them, you should be talking about them over and over and over and over again, because people don't understand things. People don't grasp things. People don't pay attention the first time you say something, but they might pay attention the second time. They might pay attention the third time. They'll probably pay attention the 10th time that you've said it, or they'll at least know it. They might be sick and tired of hearing it at that point, but that's good. We should be sick and tired of hearing the culture pieces of our worship ministry, because that's what makes our worship ministry what our worship ministry is. So say it again and again. Say it the first time to your worship team that you already have. Say it the first time to new people joining your worship team through the worship team guidelines and the process that you have in place for them to join your team, but then constantly put it in front of them. You don't have to I think we intimidate people sometimes, or they don't grasp it because we put that huge long list of what our worship culture is, those 5 points, just like in front of them. And we're like, well, I communicated this and I did it one time this month and I'll do it once again this month. No, like break it into smaller sections. And each week you can talk about one of those key pieces, and then you will always keep it in front of them. And then let's say you have 4 or 5 culture pieces. If you did that once a week, then that would take you through a whole month of worship rehearsals, and then you could start over and maybe hit it from a little different angle or whatever at the next worship rehearsal. But that's how you constantly re-communicate it to your team. One of the best times to do it is during your worship rehearsal. Let's move on to the 4th thing you need to do. The 4th thing you need to do to build the culture that you want is to create systems that reinforce the culture that you want. You can't just say, this is what our culture is, and then it becomes that. No, you actually have to build a worship ministry that reflects those culture points that you have communicated to your team. So an example of this would be preparation. Say you want your team to be prepared musically to lead worship. What would a system that reinforces that look like? It would look like getting your worship team the materials that they need to prepare well in advance, like a week before, maybe a couple weeks before, whatever it is for your team. You know the musicianship level of your team and what they need. That would be a system that you could create that could reinforce that. Then you could say, listen, we got this stuff to you a week in advance. You should learn the songs. You had time to do it, and so on. We'll get to what happens after that if they don't do that. If they don't learn their part, we'll get to that in the next point. But another example would be that worship is more than just music. If that's a culture piece, then you create events, you create moments in your worship ministry where you reinforce that point. And for example, at worship rehearsals, you have devotionals where you aren't focused on the musical side of things. You're focused on the spiritual side of things. See how we can create these systems and these structures in our worship ministry that reinforce our key culture points. So that's how you do it. Identify what's important, communicate it to your team, communicate it again to your team, and then create structures in your worship ministry that reinforce those culture points. And finally, number 5, hold people accountable to the culture you want to create. In the last point, I talked about people not being prepared to lead worship. If somebody shows up and they aren't prepared, and one of your key culture points is that people are prepared, then you have to hold them accountable to that. And what would that be? Well, it'd probably be like, you can't play on Sunday with us, which is always a tough conversation to have. But if you want to build the kind of culture that you want, then you need to hold people accountable to it. And you've got to hold yourself accountable to that as well. I didn't have this as a point, but model the kind of culture that you want to see. If you want people to be prepared, you have to be prepared. If you want people to know that worship is about more than just music, they have to see you living out a life of worship that's not just about music. So hold people accountable to the culture that you want to create. If you want them to be on time, if they don't show up on time, they can't play with you. These are hard things that we have to do as leaders, but you will only create the culture that you want if you hold people accountable, including yourself, to the culture that you want. So there it was, the 5-step process for creating the culture that you want in your worship team. So I encourage you to take a moment. Think, what are the 3 to 5 things that I want my worship ministry to be characterized by? And then communicate it to your team. Communicate it again to your team. Start thinking about structures that you can put in place to reinforce those culture points, and then hold people accountable to those culture points once you've communicated it to them. Another great way to build culture in your worship team is through your worship team rehearsals. I talked about this earlier in the video, but that's why I put together the worship rehearsal blueprint. It's linked down in the description below. In it, I share with you the 5-step process that you can use, implement it directly into your worship ministry to have the best worship rehearsals you've ever had. There's 5 simple parts. You'll be able to lead your team well spiritually, relationally, musically. Check it out in the description below. Other than that, thanks so much for joining me. Till I see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.